First tonight, a senior White House official says G7 leaders have agreed on using $50 billion in interest from frozen Russian assets to extend a loan to Ukraine. The official said there'd been political agreement at the highest levels at the summit in southern Italy, the resort town of Bari. Beyond Ukraine, the leaders of the world's 7 biggest economies have quite a packed agenda at that meeting, including Gaza, climate change, relations with African nations, illegal migration, and the rise of the far right across Europe. Illegal migration is one of Italy's biggest concerns, particularly with thousands of people every year trying to get across the Mediterranean from Africa to southern Europe. The Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, has been trying to reach out to parts of the world beyond Europe's borders, saying that the G7, under the chairmanship of Italy, wants to strengthen its relations with the global south. Italy is asking other nations to contribute to a plan which gives African countries grants and loans to develop their economies and green energy projects. But correspondents say there's considerable suspicion that it may be a cover for Italy to crack down on migration.
Non è una fortezza chiusa in se stessa che deve magari difendersi da qualcuno, è un'offerta di valori che noi apriamo al mondo chiaramente per avere come obiettivo quello di uno sviluppo condiviso.
Giorgia Meloni. Well, for more on the G7 meeting, I'm joined now on the line from London by Arise European Affairs analyst Dr. Marek Lazkeiwicz. Good to see you, Dr. Lazkeiwicz. Just tell us what we're likely to see coming out of the summit, particularly on Ukraine.
Well, there are 3 points to make. First and foremost, the G7 summit is not as important as one would think. It is really Washington and America who are the key player, and it is their decisions, especially the recent idea of a 10-year funding plan and aid plan for Ukraine, which will be, I quote, Trump-proof, is what I think President Biden called it. This is far more important because that is the major player. Number 2, what G7 is doing is in itself by no means as superb for Ukraine as meets the eye. This is a loan. Loans have to be repaid. And if they don't, who is the guarantor? Number 3, taking whatever assets or interest on assets or whatever, which technically belongs to Russia, is a highly questionable act because A, you're doing something which is at best quasi-legal, and that's exactly what, of course, Russia has been accused of doing illegal actions such as invading countries. So the moral high ground is being slowly lost. B, it is by no means clear that taking Russian assets for a loan is in the long run going to especially help because Ukraine needs far more money than that. And C, it's another minor escalation. And therefore, as we escalate slowly towards World War III, Russia could, in its way, use this as a good excuse for carrying out further actions, as we recently saw when President Biden said that Ukraine can attack them. So on the whole, this is not a summit to be especially thankful for.
Well, from your analysis, it certainly sounds like it isn't. But, I mean, is it possible that the rise of the far-right parties in Europe, I mean, Italy being one of them, might affect the consensus on any common viewpoint on Ukraine? I mean, is that, at the very least, likely to make the negotiations tougher?
Yes, absolutely. The central problem about the rise of the far right is it implies nationalism at the expense of federalism. Now, this means that the EU, insofar as it is a federal body, is weakened and so can no longer speak with one voice. It also implies that the nations want to look after themselves, are unenthusiastic about helping others. And this is in keeping with the idea that Ukraine is supposed to get a loan and not simply a grant of a substantial sum of money. And therefore, the far right will, the rise of it, not only affect the Ukraine war, but other issues as well, because the implication is quite clear. One can negotiate with EU, but ultimately the nations themselves may choose not to follow along and instead follow their own interests.
And of course, the G7 summit is being hosted by Giorgia Meloni, Giorgia, of course, the Prime Minister of Italy, who is basking in the glory of the recent European election results. And she's arguably the strongest European leader going into this summit because she was the only one strengthened by the European elections last weekend. I mean, the likes of Emmanuel Macron of France and Olaf Scholz of Germany have been floored by the far right success in their countries.
Oh, yes, quite. You can go further. She's the only leader who may be with us after some time. Of course, we've talked about Macron, but Rishi Sunak, the British Prime Minister, is on no stronger grounds. And it is entirely possible that all the others may disappear. At the very least, they are weakened. As you rightly pointed out, Germany has also been weakened by this result. And this makes it all the more difficult for the EU to maintain a firm positive stance about anything. And therefore, insofar as the EU, the G7 suffers from precisely the same problem, that many of its members who have turned up there are, of course, weakened by these results. And so the G7, like I mentioned, the EU, will be unable to speak with just one firm voice.
Well, meanwhile, of course, as we continue to assess the success and gains of far-right parties across Europe, I mean, we're seeing that the centre-right Republicans in France have expelled their leader after he proposed an alliance with the far-right National Rally in the upcoming French snap elections. I mean, so after a day of chaos, is it now confirmed that the Republicans have expelled their leader, Eric Ciotti, or is that all a farce?
Well, the problem is it's a farce. They can't escape that point. Whether they expel him or not, they've succeeded in weakening themselves against what is a far more united far right. Let's say he goes, quite okay. The point is, who takes over, and not just takes over, but do they have much an alternative? Because the reason why he suggested a link to the far right is because they're becoming hammered at the elections, and therefore it's quite possible that the next person may find himself in a similar quandary, which is what drove up around this crisis in the first place. Hence, I return to your word, alas, it is a farce.
And of course, Dr. Lazkeiwicz, France is going through what one commentator called a political earthquake after, as you mentioned there, President Macron dissolved Parliament. And in any earthquake, I mean, you have a lot of dead bodies, don't you? So a very tormented political scene, not just on the right and centre, but on the left as well, as I understand it.
Yes, but the key point here is what will happen at this unnecessary election? Because it is unnecessary. There was no need for Macron to have dissolved Parliament. And if the far right comes in, it will be a real earthquake, and the effects could be quite staggering. It is by no means clear that the far right wants to support Ukraine. Therefore follows that at the very least, there's going to be questions, and France is going to be, how can you put it, an indecisive, unsettled player for weeks to come, until it is quite clear who's won, what their policy is, and how they're going to do it. And it's not a good moment for an indecisive France, as France is a very important country in her way.
Indeed. And is it your sense, Dr. Lazkeiwicz, that what Mr. Macron is trying to do is to scare and frighten voters with the notion that chaos is settling into French politics and that the far right, at least, may well be running the next French government, which of course would have huge consequences, as you said, for Ukraine and for the EU?
Yes, quite so. Problem is, this is a gamble which has failed, at least in British history, twice before. The first, most obvious, was, of course, David Cameron, who was quite certain he would win backing for his plan, but didn't, hence Brexit Britain. And equally, Winston Churchill, having won World War II, and he was, of course, a very great leader, started scaring people about how Labour were going to be a totalitarian system of some sort, also lost. The fact of the matter is, when politicians talk like this, it doesn't mean to say that people are listening or remotely convinced. The real question will be at the polls, and I think that his tactic is at best going to result in perhaps some people being vaguely worried, but a great many others are just going to shrug it off and vote as they wanted. And this is, and of course, the real point is, this is actually his thinking. He really did, like David Cameron did, think that he would win as a result of such a message. And I do not think that this message will suffice.
And of course, the second round of those French elections will take place just 3 weeks before the Olympic Games in Paris, which potentially adds to that chaos.
Indeed, far more than that. It is quite possible that some countries may choose to boycott the Olympic Games if the far right win. And of course, the far right may themselves use this Olympics as a vehicle for their own propaganda. This is what Hitler did when he was charged, of course, in the famous games that took place, or infamous, if you prefer, during his run-up to World War II. So the Paris elections and the Paris Olympics are closely linked. And again, we must come back to the word unsettled, at best, is the view that I have of France for the next few weeks.
Very interesting, if a little bit worrying analysis there. Thank you very much indeed. Dr. Marek Lazkeiwicz is a RISE European Affairs analyst who was talking to me on the line there.